Captain John Miller stared at the transfer orders on his screen. His hand shook slightly as he read them again. After 15 years of service to the Galactic Coalition, they were sending him to the HMS Persistence. Everyone in the fleet knew about this ship. It was old. It was weak. It was a joke. This must be a mistake, he muttered to himself in the privacy of his quarters. His last mission had been successful. His record was clean. Why would they punish him like this? He called his superior officer, Commander Diane Lewis. "I'm sorry, John," she said, her face serious on the screen. The decision came from high up. The Persistence needs a new captain, and they chose you. "But it's scheduled for the scrapyard next year," Miller argued. "It's the oldest ship still in service. The engines barely work." Commander Lewis sighed. "Look at it this way. It's just for a year. Then you'll get a better assignment." Miller knew there was no point arguing further. He packed his few belongings that same day and headed to Orbital Station 7, where the Persistence was docked. The shuttle ride to the station was quiet. Miller looked out at the stars and wondered how his career had come to this. The Persistence wasn't just old. It was from the first generation of Coalition ships. Most of its systems were outdated by 30 years or more. To make things worse, his new crew would be mostly human. Humans had only joined the Coalition 30 years ago. Many of the older alien species still didn't trust them. Humans were seen as too unpredictable, too quick to break rules. The shuttle docked with a soft thud. Miller grabbed his bag and stepped out into Station 7. A woman in a Coalition uniform waited for him. She had short brown hair and a friendly smile. "Captain Miller, I'm Lieutenant Susan Rogers, your new second-in-command." Miller shook her hand. "Lieutenant, I hope you can tell me why I've been sent to command a floating museum." Rogers smiled wider. "The Persistence isn't what everyone thinks, sir. You might be surprised." Miller doubted that very much. They walked through the station to the docking area where the Persistence was attached. When they reached the viewing window, Miller stopped and stared. The ship was small compared to modern vessels. Its hull showed patches of repairs and different metal colors. It looked like it had been fixed too many times. "That's it?" Miller asked, unable to hide his disappointment. "She may not look like much," Rogers admitted, "but appearances can be deceiving." They boarded through the main airlock. Inside, the corridors were narrow, and the lighting flickered occasionally. Rogers led him on a tour of the ship. The bridge was cramped, with old-style control panels. The weapons systems were 2 generations behind current standards. The engines, according to the specs, could barely reach half the speed of modern ships. "I'll introduce you to some key crew members," Rogers said, leading him down to engineering. The engine room was a surprise. It was cleaner and more organized than Miller expected. A tall man with dark hair looked up from a console as they entered. "Captain Miller, this is Engineer Paul Clark," Rogers said. Clark wiped his hands on a cloth and offered one to Miller. "Welcome aboard, Captain. Don't believe everything you've heard about this ship." Miller shook his hand. "I've seen enough to know the stories aren't exaggerated." Clark smiled mysteriously. "Maybe you haven't seen everything yet." He pressed a hidden panel on the wall, and a section slid open to reveal a compartment filled with equipment Miller didn't recognize. "What is this?" Miller asked, stepping closer. "This," Clark said proudly, "is why we're glad to have a human captain. The Coalition thinks this ship is worthless, so they don't pay much attention to what we do here." He gestured at the strange technology. "We're going to show them how wrong they are." For the first time since receiving his orders, Miller felt a spark of interest. "Show me more," he said. 3 weeks passed, and Captain Miller began to understand why humans had been assigned to the Persistence. Other species in the Coalition followed rules strictly. They did things by the book. Humans were different. They found new ways to solve old problems. Miller watched his crew work with growing respect. They didn't see the ship's limits as barriers. They saw them as challenges. One morning, Miller visited the weapons room where Lisa Johnson was working. Johnson was small with curly red hair, but her mind was sharp. She had taken apart the ship's main defense system and rebuilt it completely. "This isn't in any coalition manual," Miller said as he examined her work. Johnson smiled. "That's the point, Captain. Every other ship in the fleet uses the same systems in the same ways. The enemy knows what to expect." She pointed to a modified targeting computer. "We're creating something no one will expect." Miller nodded slowly. What she said made sense. "Show me how it works." Johnson demonstrated the new system. It could fire from angles that shouldn't have been possible. It used less power but hit harder. It broke every rule in coalition weapon design. Later that day, Miller visited engineering again. Paul Clark and his team had been working on the engines nonstop. "We've increased speed by 30%, Clark said proudly. "And that's just the beginning." "How?" Miller asked. "These engines are ancient." Clark pointed to a series of bypasses they had created. The safety protocols were made for cautious species with 1,000-year lifespans. Humans can handle more risk. He showed Miller how they had redirected power and removed limitations. "We won't live 900 years, so we're willing to push harder." Miller found the same story throughout the ship. In the communication room, Officer Kelly Martinez had rewired everything. Her dark eyes lit up as she explained her changes. "We can now pick up signals that would normally require special equipment," she said, "and we can hide our own transmissions in background noise." Security Chief Alan White had changed the ship too. He was a quiet man with steady hands and clever ideas. He had created hidden passages inside the Persistence, secret rooms, new defense points. "None of this is on the official maps," White explained. "If we're ever boarded, we'll have advantages they can't prepare for." By the end of the month, Miller realized that the Persistence was becoming something new, something dangerous. His crew had broken nearly every regulation in the book. They had rebuilt systems, rewired controls, and reinvented how the ship worked. During a meeting with his officers, Miller finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "Why hasn't anyone stopped this? Surely Coalition Command knows what we're doing." Susan Rogers exchanged looks with the others before answering. "They know we're making some changes, Captain, but they don't know how many or how big. They assigned humans to this ship because they think we can't cause much trouble on such an old vessel. And they don't really care," added Paul Clark. "This ship is headed for the scrapyard next year. As long as we do our basic patrols and don't cause problems, they leave us alone." Miller looked at each of his officers. All of them watched him with hopeful eyes. They were waiting to see if he would continue to allow their work or if he would report them. "What we're doing here breaks at least 50 coalition regulations," Miller said slowly. The room grew tense. Then he smiled. "So we better make sure it works perfectly. I want to see every modification, every change, every improvement. If we're going to turn this ship into something new, we'll do it right." The tension broke. His officers smiled back at him. "Welcome to the real Persistence, Captain," Susan Rogers said. "We think you're going to like it here." The Persistence was on patrol in the outer edge of Coalition space. Captain Miller sat in his command chair on the bridge. The crew worked quietly at their stations. They had been out here for 3 days, watching for any signs of trouble. "This sector is always quiet," said Susan Rogers. She stood beside Miller's chair, looking at the main screen. "I don't think we'll see any action." As if answering her words, the communication system beeped loudly. Kelly Martinez turned in her seat. "Captain, we're getting a distress call," she said. "It's from Verita IV. The mining colony there is under attack." Miller straightened in his chair. "Put it through." A scratchy voice filled the bridge. "This is Verita IV mining colony. We are under attack by Cracks raiders. They've already landed on the south side. We have families here. Please help." The Cracks were a problem in this part of space. They lived on ships and attacked small colonies to steal supplies and equipment. "Are there any other coalition ships nearby?" Miller asked. Martinez checked her screen. Yes, but they're all at least 3 hours away. We can get there in 2. Miller looked at Susan Rogers. What do you think, Lieutenant? Are we ready for this? Rogers hesitated. We're not combat ready by official standards, but we've made a lot of changes to this ship. I think we can help. Miller nodded and made his decision. Set course for Verita IV, maximum speed. All crew to battle stations. The ship hummed as Clark pushed the engines to their new limits. They moved faster than any ship of their class should have been able to go. Miller called his officers to the bridge for a quick meeting. The cracks have never seen our ship before. They won't know what we can do, he said. We'll use that surprise. Martinez, can you make us look like something else on their scanners? Martinez nodded. I can make us look like a damaged freighter, the kind they like to attack. Perfect. Johnson, are your weapons ready? Lisa Johnson smiled. Yes, Captain. All systems are working. They expect this ship to have standard coalition weapons. They're in for a surprise. White, prepare a security team in case we need to send help to the ground. Alan White stood straighter. Already done, sir. They reached Verita IV in just under 2 hours. The planet was mostly brown and red, with small green areas where people had built farms. The mining colony was on the edge of a mountain range. I can see 3 crack ships, Martins reported. They're still landed. It looks like they're loading stolen goods. Take us in behind the largest moon, Miller ordered. Martinez, start broadcasting the freighter signal. Make us look damaged. Let's see if they take the bait. The Persistence moved into position. Soon, one of the crack ships left the planet and headed toward them. They're coming to check us out, Rogers said. They think we're easy prey. Let them get close, Miller said calmly. Johnson, be ready. The crack ship grew larger on the screen. It was twice the size of the Persistence, with weapons pointed directly at them. They're calling us, Martins said. They want us to surrender or they'll fire. Miller smiled. Tell them we're having communication problems. Keep them talking for 30 more seconds. The crack ship came even closer. When it was within perfect range, Miller gave the order. Now Johnson. Johnson activated the new weapons system. The Persistence fired from angles the crack ship wasn't expecting. Their shields dropped almost instantly. They're trying to turn away, Rogers reported. They look confused. They should be, Miller said. Hit their engines, Johnson. I want that ship disabled, not destroyed. Johnson fired again. The crack ship stopped moving, drifting in space with its engines dark. The other crack ships are taking off from the surface, Martinez said. They're coming to help their friend. Miller felt calm and sure. Good. Let them come. We're just getting started. The battle ended quickly. The Persistence moved like no coalition ship the cracks had ever seen. It turned faster, fired from unexpected angles, and seemed to know what the raiders would do before they did it. 2 crack ships were destroyed when they refused to surrender. The third one gave up after seeing what happened to its friends. The mining colony was saved, and the people there called Captain Miller and his crew heroes. 3 days later, the Persistence returned to Coalition Space Station 12 for supplies. Miller knew their victory would not go unnoticed. He was right. Captain Miller, said the communications officer, there's a message for you from Coalition Command. It's Admiral George Washington. Miller felt his stomach tighten. Admiral Washington was one of the most powerful people in the fleet. If he knew what they had done to the Persistence, they could all be in serious trouble. I'll take it in my quarters, Miller said. The Admiral's face appeared on Miller's screen. He was an older man with gray hair and a serious expression. Captain Miller, he said, I've received reports about your engagement with the Cracks Raiders. 3 enemy ships defeated by a single outdated coalition vessel. Quite impressive. Thank you, sir, Miller said carefully. My crew performed exceptionally well. Indeed. So exceptional that I'm having trouble believing it. The Admiral leaned closer to the screen. The Persistence is not supposed to be capable of what your reports describe. I'm coming to see for myself. My ship will arrive tomorrow. Be prepared for a full inspection." The screen went dark. Miller called an emergency meeting with his officers. "We're in trouble," he told them. "Admiral Washington is coming to inspect the ship. He knows something is different about us." The room was silent for a moment. Then Susan Rogers spoke. "We knew this might happen, Captain. But the Coalition values results. We saved that colony when no one else could." "They'll still want to know how we did it," Miller said. "And when they see how many regulations we've broken, they could separate us all." Paul Clark stood up. "Then we don't let them see everything. We can hide some of our modifications, show them enough to explain our success, but keep our biggest secrets." They worked through the night. The crew hid their most radical changes and prepared explanations for the ones they couldn't hide. They practiced what they would say, how they would show just enough to satisfy the Admiral without revealing their full capabilities. Admiral Washington arrived the next morning with 5 inspection officers. Miller met them at the docking bay and saluted. "Welcome aboard the Persistence, Admiral." Washington nodded. "Thank you, Captain. Shall we begin? I'm particularly interested in your weapons systems and engines." Miller led the inspection team through the ship. He showed them Lisa Johnson's targeting improvements, but not the special firing angles. He showed them some of Paul Clark's engine modifications, but not the power bypasses. He was careful to reveal just enough to explain their victory against the cracks. The Admiral watched everything with sharp eyes. He asked detailed questions and took notes. After 3 hours, they returned to the bridge. "Your crew has shown remarkable creativity, Captain Miller," Washington said. "Perhaps there is something to be said for human adaptability after all." Miller felt relief wash over him. "Thank you, sir. We've tried to make the most of our assignment." The Admiral nodded. "Continue your patrol duties. I'll be following your progress with interest." After the Admiral and his team left, Miller allowed himself to relax. They had passed the inspection. Then Kelly Martinez called him to the communications room. "Captain, I intercepted a coded message from the Admiral's ship," she said quietly. "I think you should hear it." Miller listened to the decoded message and felt his blood run cold. "Project Copernicus authorized. Full surveillance of HMS Persistence crew and capabilities. Potential for replication across the fleet." Miller looked at Martinez. "They don't want to shut us down." "No," she agreed. "They want to steal our ideas." Captain Miller called his senior officers to the secure meeting room they had built inside what the ship's plans showed as a storage closet. The room was small, but it was freed from any possible listening devices. "They're watching us," Miller told his team. "The Admiral knows we've done something special with this ship, and he wants to learn all our secrets." Susan Rogers frowned. "If they find out how much we've changed, they could still punish us for breaking regulations." "Or worse," said Paul Clark. "They could take our ideas without giving us credit. Then they'd split us up and assign us to different ships." Miller nodded. "So we need to be careful. From now on, we only work on new modifications in secure areas, and we act normal when we know other Coalition ships are nearby." News came a week later. The Zexer Imperium, a rival power to the Coalition, was building up ships along the border. The Coalition was sending every available vessel to show strength, including the Persistence. "They're sending us to a possible combat zone," Miller told his officers. "Either they think we're actually useful in a fight now, or they're hoping to see what else this ship can do under pressure." Paul Clark smiled. "Or they're using us as target practice." "Either way," Miller said, "we have 2 weeks to get ready. I want this ship to be able to surprise everyone, including the Coalition admirals who will be watching us." The crew worked harder than ever during the journey to the border. Lisa Johnson finished a new weapons system that could disable enemy ships without destroying them completely. "It sends out a special energy pulse," she explained to Miller. "It disrupts their power systems for about 5 minutes, long enough for us to escape, or for them to reconsider fighting. Paul Clark's team completed work on what he called the jump drive. Normal ships need time to enter hyperspace, he said. This system lets us make tiny jumps almost instantly. We can jump behind an enemy or away from danger in seconds. Is it safe? Miller asked. Clark shrugged. Safer than being destroyed. The Coalition thinks it's too dangerous because the calculations need to be perfect, but we've programmed it to handle that. Susan Rogers worked with the officers to create new battle plans that used all their special modifications. These plans broke every rule in Coalition combat manuals. They would confuse enemies who expected normal Coalition tactics. Kelly Martinez improved the communication systems even more. Now they could listen to enemy ships without being detected. They could also send fake messages that sounded real. As they approached the border, Miller walked through his ship with pride. The Persistence still looked old and weak from the outside, but inside, it had become something new. The Coalition fleet was huge, over 200 ships of all sizes. The Persistence was assigned to support Group Delta at the back of the formation. They were to stay away from the main action and only help if absolutely needed. They're putting us where they think we won't cause trouble, Alan White said when he saw their orders. And where their ships can keep an eye on us, added Rogers. Miller looked at the tactical display showing the Coalition fleet and the Zexer ships facing them across the border. There were more enemy ships than expected, almost twice as many as intelligence had reported. The Coalition plans won't work against those numbers, Miller said quietly. Their standard tactics are too predictable. We could show them a better way, Rogers suggested. Miller thought about his career, about regulations, about duty. Then he thought about the lives that would be lost if the coming battle went badly. We'll follow orders, he said finally. For now. But be ready. I have a feeling Support Group Delta might need to provide some unexpected support before this is over. His officers nodded. They understood. They would wait and watch, but they were ready to act when the moment came. The battle began suddenly. The Zexer ships moved forward as one, breaking the tense standoff. Coalition commanders shouted orders over the communication channels. Large warships moved into formation while smaller vessels took defensive positions. From Support Group Delta, Captain Miller and his crew watched the initial engagement. The Coalition ships fought well, using standard tactics, but the Zexer had too many ships. Coalition Battle Group Alpha is taking heavy damage, reported Kelly Martinez. Battle Group Beta is trying to help them. Susan Rogers studied the tactical display. The Zexer know exactly what our ships will do. They're counting on the Coalition to follow standard procedures. Hour by hour, the situation grew worse. 3 Coalition ships were destroyed. Several more were badly damaged. The front line was breaking. Support Group Delta is ordered to reinforce the front, Martinez announced. All ships to move forward and assist Battle Group Beta. Miller looked at his officers. It's time. Follow the order to move forward, but be ready for my command. The Persistence joined the other support ships moving toward the battle. Ahead, they could see the bright flashes of weapons fire. Coalition ships were fighting hard, but losing ground. Miller watched the larger battle on his display. The Coalition admirals kept trying the same tactics with small changes, but the Zexer countered each move easily. The Coalition is losing because they're predictable, Miller said. He made his decision. All hands, prepare for Operation Wildcard. His crew moved quickly to their positions. They had practiced this plan many times. Sir, said Martinez, Coalition Command is ordering all ships to maintain formation. Acknowledge the order, Miller replied. But don't follow it. The Persistence broke away from the support group. Other Coalition captains sent angry messages, but Miller ignored them. Clark, prepare the jump drive, Miller ordered. Johnson, ready the disabling weapon. Martinez, prepare the false communications. White, secure all systems for combat maneuvers. Susan Rogers stood beside Miller's chair. The admirals will be furious. Only if we fail, Miller said. If we succeed, They'll pretend this was their plan all along. The Persistence activated its jump drive. In an instant, the ship disappeared from its position and reappeared behind the Zexer front line. No coalition ship had ever done this before. The enemy was completely surprised. "Target the Zexer command ships," Miller ordered. "Use the disabling weapon." Lisa Johnson fired the new weapon. Pulses of energy hit 3 Zexer command ships. Their lights flickered and went dim. Without orders from their commanders, the Zexer ships near them became confused. "Martinez, now," Miller said. Kelly Martinez sent false orders across Zexer communication channels. She made them sound like they came from Zexer commanders. Some enemy ships began to retreat. Others turned to fire on the wrong targets. The Persistence jumped again, appearing in a different spot behind enemy lines. More Zexer ships were hit with the disabling weapon. More false orders were sent. Chaos spread through the Zexer fleet. They had never faced an enemy that could appear anywhere, disable their ships without destroying them, and confuse their communications. Coalition ships noticed what was happening. A few bold captains broke from the standard formation and began to fight in less predictable ways. They couldn't jump like the Persistence, but they could change their tactics. "Coalition Command is ordering us to return to formation immediately," Martinez reported. "Tell them we're experiencing communication problems," Miller replied. "We can only receive, not send." The Persistence jumped again, appearing near a group of damaged coalition ships that were under heavy attack. Johnson fired the disabling weapon at the attacking Zexer vessels, giving the coalition ships time to retreat to safety. From his command chair, Miller watched the battle shift. The Zexer advantage was disappearing. Their carefully planned attack was falling apart because of one small ship that refused to follow the rules. "Coalition Command has stopped ordering us back," Martinez said with a smile. "Now they're asking what we're doing and how we're doing it." Miller nodded. "Tell them we'll explain everything after we win this battle." The battle ended with a coalition victory that no one had thought possible. The Zexer fleet retreated back across the border, leaving damaged ships behind. Coalition losses were much smaller than expected. The Persistence returned to formation after the fighting stopped. Captain Miller knew there would be questions. He was right. "Captain Miller, report to Coalition Command Ship Vanguard immediately," came the order from Admiral Washington himself. Miller took a small shuttle to the Vanguard, a massive ship that served as the fleet's mobile headquarters. Guards met him and took him to a large meeting room. Inside, 5 admirals sat at a long table. Admiral Washington was in the center. "Captain Miller," the admiral said, "your actions today broke nearly every combat regulation we have." Miller stood tall. "Yes, sir. You ignored direct orders. You left formation. You used technology that hasn't been approved." The admiral's voice was stern. "Yes, sir," Miller repeated. He would not apologize for saving lives. Admiral Washington was quiet for a moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. "And in doing so, you saved this fleet from a serious defeat." Miller blinked in surprise. This was not what he had expected. "Your ship performed in ways we didn't think possible," continued the admiral. "Your tactics confused the enemy completely. Other captains have reported how the Persistence appeared and disappeared, disabled Zexer ships without destroying them, and somehow sent false orders to enemy vessels." Another admiral leaned forward. "We want to know how you did it. All of it." Miller thought carefully before answering. "My crew is very creative, sir. They found ways to improve our ship that weren't in any manual." "Clearly," said Admiral Washington. "And now we need those improvements throughout the fleet." 2 weeks later, Miller stood on the observation deck of Coalition Space Station 7. Below him, he could see a line of old ships being brought in. They looked like the Persistence once had, outdated and weak. Susan Rogers joined him. "Project Wildcard," she said. "That's what they're calling it. Taking old ships and making them new again, using our ideas." Miller nodded. "And they want us to train the crews, teach them to think differently." The Admiralty had made their decision. Instead of punishing Miller and his crew, they had created a new division, unconventional warfare. The Persistence would be the first of a new class of ships that focused on surprising the enemy rather than using brute force. Human crews are being assigned to all of them, Rogers said. Apparently, our unpredictable nature is now considered a good thing. Miller smiled. Other species in the coalition lived for hundreds or thousands of years. They had time to perfect standard ways of doing things. Humans, with their shorter lives, had to try new ideas, take risks, find shortcuts. "Captain," called a voice. Miller turned to see Paul Clark approaching with a group of engineers from other ships. "We're ready to start the first training session." In a large room nearby, officers from 10 different ships waited to learn the secrets of the Persistence. They looked eager but doubtful. Many of them had been assigned to old ships like Miller had been. They thought it was a punishment. "Welcome," Miller said as he entered the room. "You're about to learn how to turn the fleet's weakest ships into its most feared." Over the next months, more old ships were transformed. They didn't look different from the outside, but inside they were revolutionary. Each crew added their own ideas to the basic changes Miller's team taught them. Across the galaxy, reports began to spread about strange coalition ships that fought like nothing seen before. They appeared from nowhere, disabled enemies in impossible ways, and moved in patterns no one could predict. "Approach with extreme caution," warned one Zexer intelligence report. "These are not normal coalition vessels. They are nightmare machines." Miller read the report and smiled. Not bad for the fleet's weakest ship.